Great pleasure to now introduce our next speaker. A very warm welcome to Jitish Kallat. Hi again, very good to see you. It's wonderful, we are every day together on a panel. Yesterday at the Art Summit, today here. I wanted to begin with the beginning and ask you about the recurrent question, how the Bayesian Ada question, how it all started. Because you started very young, you came into the art world very young. What were your beginnings and what were your inspirations, your influences, your heroes? I think the mic is not yet working. Maybe have a mic.
I try to think of an epipanic moment, but haven't been able to come up with one decisive moment. But I do remember this, small realization that my good South Indian Malayali family had, that I might possibly be driven towards art because my sister, who was 8 years older than me, and all her friends used to get their illustrations in their sort of college and school books drawn by me. So I think that was a realization of epiphany for the family. But for me, I think it was a slow drifting towards image making. I think we all begin to draw and then get we don't know the entire idea of art, but I think there's this broad notion of this is something one wants to do, and that's how one lands in art school. But I remember some early days in art school, my uncle, my mom's youngest brother, handed me Tagore's Gitanjali, and I was barely 16. And I remember carrying this in the very first year of my art school in these crowded local trains, and being absolutely absorbed by that little, piece of poetry. And I think that had something to do with my early moments, but not a clear, decisive moment of how I came to art.
And it seems also that the city of Mumbai, that the streets of Mumbai played a very big role. It wasn't only inspiration from art and inspiration from literature, but a lot from the city and where you've lived so far your entire life. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about Mumbai, how you see change, the mutations of the city, and to which extent the city is your studio, your inspiration.
In the sort of last couple of years, I've been thinking back a lot about my work, and in a sense I realized that much of the images have actually come from the space of a railway station. In a sense, so if I really think about it, it's really those early days of commuting that I think has continued to sort of be a space that I keep going back to in terms of imagery. So I think it's probably the space of the railway station and probably the space of the street that I feel carries, in a sense, almost all the sort of codes of life, in a sense. It's even hard to sort of re-articulate what we all know, but the street has within it, I think, all those elements that the art, in a sense, classically aspires to connect with. And I think for me, it's this constant sense of having to just I can't even say it's a sense of catching up, but I think it's just that sense of life the way it is played out in your own neighborhood, I think tends to feed into everything you do, and that includes your art.
And how would you see, because obviously you are very local in Mumbai, it's the city where you work, and a lot of material of your work comes from there. How do you see the negotiation between the local and the global? I very often speak to Edouard Glissant, who talks about this idea of mondialité. He talks about this idea, first of all, that we can only understand about in the current moment of violent globalization if we are resolutely local somewhere. He wrote this beautiful book, La Cohue du Lamentin. It's a real drama that Edouard Glissant still is not more translated, because I think he is the greatest, one of the greatest writers of our time, and to our time what maybe Deleuze or Foucault were 20 or 30 years ago. And Glissant also says there are different forms of negotiation. We can either embrace globalization and then differences disappear, or we can refuse globalization and go into some kind of reactionary repli and miss out on the great opportunities or possibilities of global dialogue. And then he proposes a solution, which is basically a permanent negotiation of mondialité, which is to engage with global dialogue, but to produce differences. between the local and the global. How would you see this negotiation? Because it seems to be something which does take place in your work.
You know, I don't know, Hans, whether, you know, as an artist, when one works, one essentially thinks of these as categories or separate regions that we make choices between, either for or against. You know, I think, and I think the moment that I sort of entered art school, I think was also the moment when, you know, a lot of things were changing around us. I mean, this was the moment of the opening up of India in a sense, and, you know, and I think that somehow has fed into, when I look back into the sort of genetic code of everything else I've done. I mean, the year I entered art school was also a year of tremendous change, I think, within our living rooms, and I think Shilpa pointed out, you know, this whole thing of television, and I think that was really having an impact on how one was thinking. And yesterday I was talking about how this was all mediated from the Far East in a sense for a good 5 years, and I think so this whole sense of what the international was and how these were being mediated through, you know, a certain Asian network, of television network, for instance. I think all of these factors at the very beginning and genesis of one practice, I think, continues to impact everything one does. So I think there's a sort of collapsed notion of the local and the global. I don't want to sort of erase any texture that there might be, but I mean, as of now, it's hard to kind of articulate in very clear terms or separate terms, really.
I was also curious because yesterday you talked a lot about a sort of a circuitry idea. You talked about circuits, you talked about new maps, you talked about new calendars. Can you maybe explain that a little bit more?
I mean, I was really thinking, you know, when Dinesh posed this question about the circuitry to us, whether is this circuitry of this certain nomadism that's kind of set in globally, but also specifically within the art world, because we are talking about the art world, whether these were circuits of time, whether these are new calendars that are formed that everyone recognizes, or are these circuits of places or circuits of ideas, and when does India enter the circuit? And in that sense, you know, it was really about, and to me, recounting or just narrating the short history was a way of actually trying to see if we had those adapters and transformers to deal with the circuitry, because it is an intense circuitry, you know. And I think the moment of contact, which happened broadly in the 90s and then very intensely since the year 2000, I think there was an internal circuitry within India, you know, that could, you know, that wouldn't detonate or short circuit with this connection. So it was really kind of just thinking about these last 15 years in response to the question of our panel.
Now, in your work, there are lots of parallel realities. There is your paintings, there is your lenticular photographs, there is the sculptural work. All these things seem to happen parallel to each other. It's not one after the other, but it's all parallel. Can you tell us how this functions, how your studio operates? I'm very interested in how your studio operates. I mean, we heard earlier today from Dianita that she would never do a feature film because she really wants to work on her own. She doesn't work assistants, she doesn't work collaborators.
Yes.
You seem to work in a very different way. You have a studio, you probably have assistants. How does your studio work as a studio of these parallel realities? And what are you working on at the moment?
I mean, you know, a couple of things, Hans. One is the sort of how the studio functions and how do I operate within the studio, but also, I mean, for me, it's always a bigger question of how do I negotiate the sort of several ends of my practice. I mean, I see in the very recent months that I'm drifting into a certain sort of autobiographical mode that I'm having to actually deal with it at this point, trying to sort of wonder where that's coming from in a sense, you know. And I think, so, I mean, one is this essentially trying to sort of work out the different directions in which one's mind seems to go, and then ensuring that the studio can actually deal with that. So in a sense, I mean, the physical processes are often less interesting and less challenging. I mean, you know, in the sense that, you know, the actual realization of the work is sheer labor, and one is willing to labor, you know. But it's when one actually really deals with doubts about the extreme directions in which one's own sort of mind and thoughts tend to go, as I'm actually experiencing at this very moment, that there are extreme directions in which I'm thinking at the same time, and really negotiating that, you know, because at one level I'm sort of drifting towards looking at history, and another is really familial history and ancestry and, you know, all of this other things. So and I don't know if I'm actually able to really clear my throat in mid-passage, even as I sort of, you know, look at all of these things together.
Now, very recent work is your important project in Chicago. which in some very direct way actually connects to history with this project on the Grand Staircase. Can you tell us about this? Because it's also interesting, it's actually connected to your very early pieces also, which have to do with text.
That's right. The piece that got realized now on September 11th actually is a moment that I've been referring to since 2004 in two other works, and one was in the form of a sort of burnt, incinerated text. The other was actually moving towards light and in a sense leading up to this piece, Public Notice, and it was really this overlap of dates, the overlap of very, very differing contexts of the first Parliament of Religions and the attacks, and the other element in the work is really the coding system, which is actually this daily injection of paranoia that happens when you go up the Homeland Security website that the US government puts out, and every day there's a threat level, and the threat levels never drop below the level of elevated, which is yellow. And I've been really sort of thinking about how 5 of my elements in my own toolbox as an artist today form a metering system in a terror rhetoric, and in a sense these become acts of sort of thinking back and claiming them into a conversation, which is essentially the speech, and the speech then gets refracted in these coding systems, and you actually have puddles of words as you sort of see the sort of coding system split the entire speech, which was delivered in the very building where the Art Institute stands today.
There's an ever-increasing soundtrack here to our marathon.
That's right.
Hilarious. Anyway, one thing, the Chicago project is a very ambitious project which just has been realized. And as you know, I'm very interested in unrealized projects which have been too big to be realized, utopias, dreams, concrete utopias. Can you tell us about your unbuilt roads?
See, there would be quite a few, but there are two very recent ones. One which actually an institution sort of found that it was actually a historical correspondence between two individuals, which became the core element in the work. And there was an aspect to the work which they found pretty intolerable, and hence the work could not be realized. That was one. The other is really something I am not able to sort out, which is essentially a text that I've been sitting with for a while. It's actually the justification of an assassin. And the problem I face with that text is the fact that my interest is really, it is a historical moment, but my interest in that text is not history, but essentially death, guilt, and justification just at the moment of one's death, and what that might say about life. But I think that it's a really problematic work, because I think it wouldn't be read devoid of the historical moment it comes from. So this is a kind of contradiction that I was thinking about, which sometimes leaves the work unrealized, or you kind of sit with,
We discussed with John Bow yesterday, again, once more, a point we've discussed very often, which is the Maya point. Maya standing for most advanced yet acceptable. And that's obviously something which, is very interesting in relation to public intellectuals, this idea of also art on occasions going beyond the art world and reaching out. It's something we discussed a lot with Alain Robbe-Grillet, who described the moment in the 60s when Godard, for example, and in cinema, and Robbe-Grillet and the Nouveau Roman in literature tried to do most advanced experiments, yet they were somehow playing with the mainstream. They went beyond the world of literature, beyond the world of experimental cinema, which the early films of Godard did. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that Maya thing. Is something you are interested in, and how does this negotiation happen? I mean, Mario Merz always quoted the Vietnamese General Giap, who said, if you win territory, you lose concentration.
Sorry,
if you win territory, you lose concentration, and the other way around. So how does this negotiation work? And are you interested in going beyond the art world and making an impact as a very public artist?
I don't know if one can actually set out with that intention. I think it's far more organic than that. I mean, in some ways, I see Public Notice 3 having taken a dimension and generated a conversation which I think hasn't happened with any of my other works, in a sense, and I think that dialogue has extended beyond, in some ways, the framework of the art world which a museum otherwise offers. But it's not really, it's not really an intention that I can actually, I have a plan of how one can actually extend beyond the art world, or, I don't know if I think in those terms really, Hans. I mean, although, the conversations actually leaving the fortress of the art world is the ultimate intention.
Yeah.
But I think I don't have a pathway really that I can see, how that gets realized.
Yeah, it's maybe more like Whistler studies. Art happens. It sort of happens,
right.
and but then we can try maybe from another angle, and that's my very last question, which is, I mean, the wonderful Anish Kapoor exhibition triggered a very big discussion for many different reasons, and one of the very interesting discussions is this discussion about public art, because they are all these extraordinary projects for public space, many realized and some also unrealized, and it triggered a whole discussion online and also in newspapers in India about the absence of public art. So I was wondering if you have any projects in terms of public art.
I mean, with public art in India, I'm not in a hurry to see great public art being realized in India. I think it has to be a slower process rather than a quicker one. I mean, the public space in India is a very contested one. I mean, the same political parties that might come forth and commission these projects are the ones that claim walls before elections come. I mean, they actually demarcate the walls where the party signs might go up. So when it is such a contested space, I think the journey or the injection of public art into the streets, I think I would be very cautious and slow about that whole process. I mean, as somebody said that, you can erase things off the internet, but if you lay them on the streets, they're going to come in your way. And I think, I would think of it as a slow process of and not doing it till one realizes that the people who sit at the end of policy are the people who actually realize what they're doing.
Jitish, Kallat, thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Hans.
Thanks so much. Great to see you.